She's in the police.
Okay.
So, and he's bitachon. He's, you know, head of Hagma here. So
I got it. Okay, I see Shani is on.
Yes.
Boker
Yes.
Tov.
How are you? Boker Tov. Wonderful to see everyone.
Yeah.
Oh, hello, Lee. Shavua
Hi.
Tov. What a special treat.
Shavua Tov.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love this. Mother and daughter. And this is perfect for today because, as I mentioned last week, today we're going to focus on another skill with regard to the parallels of personalities between Tanakh and Talmud. And that is, just as last week, we saw how Chazal want us to appreciate the perpetuation of ideas, both within the Torah itself, and then certainly throughout Talmudic times, which is meant to herald, obviously, the future times as well. So if we discussed, again, whether it be, again, in Parshat, again, both for Parshat Vayigash, Vayechi, the tensions between Yosef and Yehuda as really marking the future, both the feuds, again, one can even say political tensions, again, elections between the two, challenges of leadership for all time. And then today we're going to focus on a slightly different skill, and that is to appreciate what's known as conservation of personality. And perhaps this is the basis really of our shi'ur. What do I mean by that? Again, within the Tanakh itself, Chazal very often, in addition to trying to show us how figures that we're familiar with, again, whether it be, as we discussed, again, Yehuda Yosef, whether it be, again, Choni Hama'agel, reminding us of Eliyahu Hanavi, whether it be, as we're going to learn, Rabbi Akiva, reminding us of Moshe Rabbeinu, meaning, and not only are contemporary, let's put it that way, contemporary personalities linked to Tanakh, in order to show that there are similar personalities in every generation. Rather, what Chazal very often do with regard to ambiguous personalities is they tell you, wait a second, even within Tanakh, we're familiar with such personalities. And you'll see what I mean as we take a look at this week's Parshat Shmot. Let's all take a look together at the Makorot that Hila had sent out. Again, so here we go.
Shani.
Yes.
I don't know how many people paid attention to this, but it's very interesting that while we're dealing with the differences between Yehuda and Yosef, and each one is trying to, the Haftarot are all dealing with David.
Yeah, so we discussed last week, if you remember, the grafting of the two, and then ultimately David being the progeny of Yehuda that is going to be, right, the ideal merging of the two.
But even in Miketz, we have it. Even in Miketz, we have Shlomo. Yesterday, when I read through it, I said, "My goodness, you know, Chazal's trying to tell us something. That even though we have this tension, that they're telling us, but just realize that we're really going to David."
Yafe ma'od. Yafe, beautiful. Also, there are remarkable parallels, particularly between David and Yaakov Avinu. So again, we could have spent much more time on Sefer Breshit speaking about those personalities, but the reason why I'm choosing this week's Parsha is because, again, in addition to, again, what Becky's pointing out, parallels between personalities within Tanakh that we're familiar with, we also find, again, personalities in Tanakh, even of those characters that we're not so familiar with, right? Everyone appreciate the difference? One is to say, wow, I see how David HaMelech reminds me of Yaakov Avinu, just like other characters throughout history are going to remind me of Yaakov Avinu. But how about when we have ambiguous personalities? What Chazal are going to teach us is that, no, focus not on the actual character, focus on the personality, and you're going to see that you can match up actual characters that you're familiar with these personalities. Okay, if whatever I just said didn't make so much sense, not to worry, because we're going to see it applied right now in this week's Parsha, in Parshat Shmot. Let's take a look. And we know that the Parsha begins with the Shmot of Bnei Yisrael, and Chazal asks, why do we need this repeated? We already saw this in Bereshit, Perek Mem Vav, and the answer is because Bnei Yisrael actually frame, again, the story, meaning we need to know. Again, Rashi quotes, Hashem loves each and every one. We have to mention the shame. Again, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. We mention each one of the tribes by name, and then Uvnei Yisrael paru vayishritu vayirbu vayatzmu b'ma'od ma'od v'timalei ha'aretz otam. The reason why we needed to note Bnei Yisrael is because it highlights that even though they started off as 12 individual children, they're now going to develop so much that by, again, take a look at this, again, we find just 2 psukim later, pasuk ted vayomer el amo, this new king, and either a real new king or a king shenitchadshu gezerotav, who now changed his sentiments towards Yosef's family, recognizes, let's look at pasuk tet, hine am b'nei Yisrael rav va'atzum mimenu. He's going to respond to what the Torah said. Oh wow, now the people are expanding significantly in demographics. Again, and what does he call them? They're no longer, again, just children of Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. They're not just one family clan. He calls them an Am. This is the first time that we find Am Yisrael mentioned as a nation, but that's exactly the source of his fear. Oh my, now they're a nation. Now they can have an army. Now they're going to, let's take a look. What is he afraid of? Pen Yerbeh, Vayakitzer Krena Milchama, V'nosaf Gamchu also Nenu. What will happen? They will end up allying themselves with our enemy, V'nilcham Banu V'alam Min Haaretz, and then they're going to leave the land. And they're going to leave us bereft. Again, this is the pshat. They'll leave us bereft economically, again, militarily, again, where we need these people to stay in the land. So what did they do? Again, I like to call these labor laws and labor laws. Again, stage number 1 of labor laws, V'yasimu alav sari misim. As the Ramban clearly notes, stage 1, in a very covert manner, right? Let's call this SS officers, because the Ramban says this is what happens in every generation of Galut. It's a very gradual effect. How do you get from a state of, again, the people feeling so grateful to Yosef and his family, and now to a state of complete anti-Semitism? It's very gradual. And let's take a look. It starts off with literally SS officers. Just with the officers of the tax are going to take a few people out. Again, Chazal tell us first they even pay them for their labor, and they turn them into, again, basically, we'll call them concentration camps, right? Again, labor camps. Leman anotobesiv lotam, vayiven arei miskanot leparo et pitom vet Ramses. But what happened? Even if they did this on a rather smaller scale, v'chasher yanuoto ken yirbe v'chen yifrot, they thought that if they take a few people, again, and again, just specific members of Am Yisrael, and they start literally harassing them, again, they thought that that would be it, right? The people would have to move out of their homes and into the cities. And again, it would be a big schlep for them to travel every day. So they thought that this would really thwart demographics, but it didn't work. And we don't know why. Again, we're going to see that it must be, Chazal say, V'chasher yanoto, ken yirbe v'chen yifrot. Paro said, pen yirbe. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, ken yirbe. That somehow, miraculously, again, the people were able to not only survive, but were able to thrive nonetheless. So once stage 1 of labor laws didn't work, let's take a look at stage 2, Pasuk Yugimel. Ve'avidu Mitzrayim et b'nei Yisrael b'farech. Now it's not just Sari Misim. Now this became national policy. All of Egypt, in other words, all of the Egyptians now enslave b'nei Yisrael, right? Gradual effect. Vayimaru et chayehem b'avodah kasha b'chomer b'veinim b'chol avodah basada et kol avovotam avodatam asher avdu b'hem b'farech. Notice that we have the milah mancha mentioned 6 times of avodah, harsh labor. And this time it doesn't say ken yirbe v'chen yifrot, because we're going to see from the ensuing story as well that this gezerah of national concentration camps, of national, we'll call them labor camps, again, actually succeeded in thwarting the growth of Bnei Yisrael. Now we're ready to continue with Pasuk Tedvav. Either simultaneously or sometime thereafter, Paro has another idea. Again, now notice that I put this in parallel columns in order for us to appreciate that the Torah presents them as 2 separate modes of thwarting the growth of Am Yisrael. Again, one is avodah, one is labor. The other is going to be through, literally, again, we'll call this here, as we know, again, killing at birth, right? So pedicide, right? Again, killing the children at birth. Again, let's take a look at this. That's why also labor laws, right? During labor, they're going to kill the children. How is this going to be done? In a very similar manner. Firstly, in a covert, surreptitious way. He calls them mialdot ha'ivriot. Now we're going to examine this a little later as well. Who are these mialdot ha'ivriot? Even just looking at the Hebrew syntax, again, there are two ways of reading this. Either mialdot et ha'ivriot. In other words, these are Egyptian midwives who are in charge of birthing the Hebrews, right? Keeping in mind that the Hebrews live in a different section, that these are Paro's officers, because why would he think that Hebrew officers would be willing to kill their own children, right? So these are Egyptians who are in charge. They're basically, the Sarei Habriot, right? We know that in Egypt, they actually also idealize the women as goddesses. So again, it wouldn't be surprising, especially in the realm of midwifery, that there were Egyptian officers of the midwifery. And or mialdot ha-ivriot, that ivriot is describing the mialdot. No. There really were Hebrew mialdot who at this stage, especially after the first few psukim that we learned, are subjugated to Paro. And what are their names? Either the Hebrew or the Egyptian ones, Shifra and Pua. Okay, again, just remember those names, please. Vayomer bi'alatchen et ha'ivriot, when you birth the Hebrew women, uri'iten al ha'ovnayim, and you see on the birthing stones in Benhu that it's a boy, v'amitomanoto, kill him. V'imbati v'chaya. If it's a girl, keep her alive. And notice the play on words between ri'iyah and yir'ah. Uri'iten, and what did they do? Instead of seeing and killing, they saw and vatir'enna hamialdot et Elokim. They fear God. Now we know this earlier from Sefer Breshit, wherein Avram akas Avimelech gan ein yirat Elokim b'makom hazeh. We also saw it by Breshit Perach Chaf Bet. Again, the story of Akedat Yitzchak, where there are also the parallel verbs or the tzemed mila mancha of ri'iyah and yir'ah. But here it's all the more manifest in that what is yirat Elokim? It's a basic sense of morality, meaning it's not necessarily any type of religious drive that's deterring them from killing these children. It's a basic ethical backbone. So regardless of their national identity, Egyptian or Hebrew, these are women who have a basic sense of morality, sensitivity, and they fear God. In other words, they can't kill these children. Not only that, they go out of their way to keep these children alive. But wait a second, they put their own lives at risk by defying Paro Melech Mitzrayim. Sure enough, Vayikra Melech Mitzrayim lamialdot vayomer lahen, madua asiten hadavar hazeh v'tachayena et hayeladim. Why did you do this and keep the children alive? And the mialdot answer, Ki lo because the Egyptian women are not, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian ones. Ki chayotena, you yourself said that if it's a girl, v'chaya, keep her alive. Well, in fact, the Hebrew women really are alive. Again, they're so full of vitality. They don't even need us. Again, to give birth, before the midwife comes, they've already given birth. So at that point, it's too late. The first thing we hear is the reward of God to the mialdot. And what is their reward? That what they intended to do, namely to allow for the continued growth of Am Yisrael, that in fact succeeded. And this is the basis for Chazal to say, look at this. Again, here, we don't really know the reason for the lack of success of Paro, Kenya, Revach, and Yifrot. Here we do. Here was the mialdot, and then God played along with the initiative of these midwives. He allowed for the nation, regardless of this decree, because of the mialdot, sincerity and defiance, he allowed for them to continue to grow and get strong. And when the mialdot fear God, either this is a continuation of what Elokim did. He provided them with batim. As Rashi says, bate melucha, bate levia, bate kuna, again, depending on who these mialdot are. But the pshat is, wait a second, who generally are mialdot? Who are midwives? They're women who can answer, emergency calls at 2:00 o'clock in the morning. Again, in general, midwives were women who didn't necessarily have their own children. And therefore, Vayas lahem batim, God rewarded them who provided for all of these families of Am Yisrael. God rewarded them with their own families. But wait a second, this could easily be a response going back to Pasuk Yutet. When the Mialdot feared God, Paro then made them batim. What type of batim do you think Paro made for them? Ibn Ezra says, batekele. He incarcerated them. Again, don't think that everything was just so wonderful. Of course they were punished. And yet, again, they received the credit for having Yirat Elokim, for defying Paro. But after this plan, through the Mialdot didn't work, just like stage one. And the Avodah laws did not succeed, and Paro had to nationalize the decrees. So to here, they don't succeed, and therefore Paro nationalizes Vayitza Paro l'chol amo lemor kol haben hayelod hayaora tashlichu v'chol habat tachayun. All the Hebrew boys have to be cast off to the river, and the girls may be kept alive. And here we see then that unfortunately, this was clearly working, right? Both labor laws, number one, labor laws, and number two, how do you know that? Because now we're going to see a story from Pasuk Aleph through Pasuk Yud, which shows us how a particular family is responding to labor law number two, is responding to this national threat of having to kill their own child. And then we're going to see from Pasuk Yud Aleph, basically through Pasuk Tet Vav, how individuals are also responding to the Avodah law. So let's take a look. We have a beautiful cast.
Shani, going back for a minute, okay? It's not necessarily that Paro said that only the Jewish boys should be killed.
Excellent. It could be the Egyptian ones as well.
Even the Mitzri boys were being killed.
It could very well be, could be, again, and yet that seems to go against how this started, right? Pen Yerbe vayakit tikvenam l'chama v'nosaf kamhu al sonenu v'nelcham banu v'alam min haaretz. So we have to protect ourselves. He's saying to his Am, everyone basically understood from the context, all the child, kol haben of the Ivrim that should have been killed by the Mialdot, but Sarah's 100% right. It could be nationalized entirely, meaning all children, Egyptian and Hebrew, should be cast off to the Or. Even though, again, it's difficult in terms of understanding the context. The context seems to imply more the Hebrew children.
One of the Midrashim says, I remember reading it yesterday, that it was everybody because Paro wasn't sure where the Moshiach of Am Yisrael would come from. Would it come from the Ivrim?
Exactly. Very well said. Again, in which case, again, as
I couldn't hear what she said because it was background noise.
Right. Sarah said that, again, that because Paro didn't know, there's a beautiful midrash that says that the reason why Paro wanted to kill specifically through water, right? Why didn't he just say, okay, everyone just, go around and homicide, just go ahead and kill everyone. Why specifically throw them to the Or? Is that Paro knew that the Moshiach, the leader, the savior of Bnei Israel, would be punished ultimately through water, right? Moshe died because of Mei Meriva. And yet he wasn't sure where the savior would come from. Would it come from the Egyptian people? Would it come from the Hebrew people? And therefore the Midrash raises the possibility that when Paro says Kol Haben, he meant literally any boy, Egyptian or Hebrew. And that's one of the proofs that maybe this particular Gezerah, this decree, maybe didn't go on for so many years. After all, Moshe's older brother, Aharon, who's 3 years older than he, Aharon, we don't find any story of any threat to his life. So it seems that maximum, and then after Moshe is born, again, there are all these midrashim that talk about the fact that, okay, by then Paro knew that he was born, so maximum this gezerah was going on for 3 years, in which case maybe Egyptian children were also being killed, even though from context, it makes more sense to say Kol Haben is a reference to Kol Ben of the Ivrim, right? That in the context, we're talking about the Hebrews.
Johnny, that's where they say the name Miriam came from. That's when the Gezerot started, Mar.
Right. Well, they probably started, meaning the Avodah laws
started
during her time.
Right, but throwing the children.
But throwing the babies must have started after Aharon, who's 3 years younger.
Right. So that's why her name was called Miriam.
Yafe ma'od. So let's take a look and see again how individual families are responding to these two laws of the labor and literally the labor, right? The Leida laws. So what's interesting is that even though the entire Sefer begins with Eila Shmot, starting Perek Bet, we basically don't really hear any names. We have an Ish mi Beit Levi vayikach bat Levi, and we hear of a mother and a sister. We don't even hear the name of the baby when he's first born. Again, he only gets a name by Pasuk Yud. And Nachama Lebu, it says, because really this is the response of every single family in Israel. In other words, the Ish and the Isha represent all of Am Yisrael over here, right? That we're not supposed to look at the individual anymore. We're supposed to be looking at the nation. So this is a microcosm of the nation. So now let's see, and who these personalities are, what are they doing? An Ish mi Beit Levi takes a Bat Levi. Already we hear the terms of Bayit and Bat. Again, the Bat always connected to the Bayit, as a matter of fact. Again, in these stories, we're going to hear Bayit mentioned 7 times and Bat mentioned 7 times. Again, very significant. Vatar Aisha vateled ben, vater oto kitofu vatitbeneu shlosha yerachim. And the woman had a son, and notice the verbs implied. She sees him that he's good, and she hides him for 3 months. When she can no longer hide him, notice what's known as rikus pa'alim, the concentration of verbs. She doesn't stop, right? She goes out of his way to attempt to again, secure the survival of this child against all odds, right? She's going to make a teva, which saves one, as we know from the Noah story, a mode of salvation from the waters. And not just she, but and based on Shat, we see that it's particularly the female personalities who are going to be very dominant over here and trying to secure survival, right? The sister stands afar to know what will happen to him. And this should bother us a little. What does that mean? She doesn't know what's going to happen. Again, we all know just 4 psukim earlier. Again, there's a decree. I can imagine that all these, Jewish mothers are putting their, tevot into the yaor. And then these Egyptian school children on their way home are having a contest. How many of these little tevot can you drown today? Right? So what does that mean, mayaselo? And the Midrash is going to tell us that she was confident. She had this intuition that something would happen to this child, that he was in fact going to be saved. And this, as we know, we'll call it the optimism, we'll call it the, again, emunah, again, the faith that she had. Again, this we see is something that the Mialdot also had. Okay, we're going to defy and we're going to succeed, even if we don't know for sure. Take a look. Basically, the very last personality, okay, fine, the second to last personality that you would want to appear on the scene. This daughter of the king who decreed this comes. But wait a second. There's a little bit of a redeeming factor by her. Vatera etateva. She, like the mother, sees. And she, like the mother and like the Mealdot, don't just see, but they respond. Again, as she opens and she sees the child, and she sees that the child is crying, and she has mercy on the child. And what happens at that moment? The sister comes along and says, should I bring one of the nursemaids of the Hebrews to take care of the child? And she says, yes, again, bring the mother of the child. So sure enough, she brings the mother who we thought we would never see again, and the mother gets to nurse her own child. In the meantime, the child is brought to Bat Paro, and she raises him, and she's the one, because she basically assured his survival, who calls him Moshe, Kimin Hamayim Mishituhu. But that's not the end of the story. Vayigdal Hayeled, Vayigdal Moshe. This is Moshe the infant. Then Moshe grows into a child and a young man, and we're going to see how he responds to the law number 1. All the avodah that's going on. What does Moshe do? Just as his mother, his sister, his adoptive mother defied Paro and saved him from decree number 2 of the birthing laws, so too he himself wants to save his brethren from the avodah laws. He goes out, and once again, here's that verb, vayar b'sivlotam, vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'achav. Even though he grew up in the Egyptian palace, he relates to the Hebrews as his brothers, and he sees an Egyptian striking a Hebrew. Vayifen kol v'chol vayar ki enish. Again, he sees that no one else is responding, so he responds, even though he knows this is in clear defiance of Paro. And sure enough, the next day, there are 2 Hebrews who are arguing, and Moshe asks again, Vayomer l'Rasha lama takeh re'acha, why are you hitting one another? And they say, mi samcha li'ish, who do you think you are? Halargeni atamar kasher harakta tamitzri vayir Moshe. Moshe also knows how to fear. Vayomer achino dahadavar. Now he knows that Paro knows about this as well, so he runs away. Vayeshiva al habe'er. And who does he meet there? The damsels in distress. But first we hear about a parallel character, Gena, a Kohen Midian with these damsels. And even though, Gena, and sure enough, Moshe goes ahead and he saves them from the oppressive shepherds who are bothering them. And they come back and they say, an Ish Mitzri saved us from the shepherds. And the man whom we know is Yitro, Gen says, so why did you leave him? Forget about his nationality. I don't care if he's Egyptian. I don't care. He's an Ish. Again, we see a parallel character to Moshe, someone who saves others. And he is going to bring Moshe into his home. And through Yitro, again at Vateled Ben, we have a beautiful, beautiful full circle of the story. The child who saved has a child, again, who is saved through his own salvation, right? Moshe gets a child because he saved others, because he was saved, right? And sure enough, he calls him Gershom, Ger Hayiti, Be'eretz Nachriya. And just to show us the transition, Vahi Bayamim Harabim Hahim. If the second section began with Bayamim Hahim, the last section begins with Bayamim Harabim Hahim, Vayamat Melech Mitzrayim, bringing us back to Vayakam Melech Hadash. And all of Am Yisrael, how are they responding to Avodah? They're not saving, right? Moshe is seeing and Moshe is fearing, whereas they're screaming and they're sighing and their cries pierce Elokim min Avodah. And God, take a look at this. Vayishma Elokim et nakatam, vayiskor Elokim et brito et Abraham et Yitzchak bet Yaakov. Again, Elokim hears them, and Elokim says, okay, time to save you. But wait a second, who am I going to send to save you from Avodah? The person who has already started saving you from Avodah, namely Vayar Elokim et Bnei Yisrael Vayeda Elokim. What does God know? God knows that there's already a man who has that same moral backbone that we've seen in the Mialdot from the beginning of the story, and therefore he's the perfect person to be saved. So let's just go back for a minute. We already saw Breshit Perek Mem Vav, the Shemot of Bnei Yisrael by name, but once again, the whole point is to appreciate that they've died, and now, again, we're talking about a national level. So on this national level, let's go back and say, wait a second, you think that the whole story begins with the salvation of the Mialdot. Again, so a few questions that we have. Firstly, why leave the baby girls alive? The Midrash says, again, because we already know from the time period of Abraham and Sarai in Mitzrayim that the Egyptians like Hebrew women. So again, they want to keep the Hebrew women, again, for promiscuous purposes. Now is when we begin really, for all intents and purposes, the whole nuance of our shir. Here we go. Again, Chazal are bothered, and they say, wait a second. Again, these women, these Mialdot set the whole tone for individuals, and particularly the women who are going to continue to save. So what have we been seeing? Again, throughout our study of Midrash, again, we're ready. And I hope that you're already familiar with this theme and the importance of the connection between, again, Talmudic sayings and personalities and ideas that are clearly based on the Torah. So Rabbi Akiva says, he says, when you look at the story, just remember that this story serves as a precedent, as a biblical precedent for all future stories of Galut and Geula. Meaning that if you see Shifra and Pua, and then you see this Isha mi Beit Levi, and then you see this Achot, and you see Bat Paro, what is that telling you? That tells you, not just in the story of Sefer Shemot, that tells you in every single generation, you name the generation, call it the generation of Esther, right? who saves her generation. Call it the generation of Chanukah. Again, with Yehudit. Call it the generation of, again, of the Shoah, remarkable stories of women in the Holocaust. Call it, again, the generation of pogroms or crusades. You ready for this? Call it the generation of Gush Katif. Again, call it the generation of COVID. Again, who are going to be? Rabbi Akiva says, I can already guarantee you that who are going to be the remarkable personalities who will always catalyze redemption. And we're going to see that the same Rabbi Akiva is going to say that actually it's the women b'schar nashim tzidkaniot b'chol dor atidin b'nei Yisrael lihikael. Again, if you want any greater proof to this midrashic idea that we've been speaking about from the beginning of Talmudic personalities who are meant to be parallel to biblical personalities, in order for us to appreciate the perpetuation of these personalities and these names, we see them right over here in this slogan of Rabbi Akiva. And he even says, what do the women do? Not just Shifra and Puah, not just who ends up being Yocheved and Miriam and Bat Paro. I'm telling you, again, these are all the women. For example, Ma'asu, Bish'asha Yochochot L'shov Mayim, when they went to draw water for their households, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mizamein lahem dagim ktanim. And what do you know in Chazal terminology? What are fish indicative of? Basically Piria Virivia, right? They're indicative of the proliferation because they multiply very quickly. The proliferation of Bnei Yisrael. Again, so they would collect little dagim begadehen in their pitchers, v'shoavim machze mayim o machze dagim, and they would then literally schlep, again, water and fish, umolichot etzal balehen, and they would walk maybe kilometers every day to go to where their husbands were working, v'shofatot lahem shtei kderot, achat shel chamin v'achat shel dagim, and they would prepare for them. Again, one pot of water, meaning they would heat up the water, and another a fish. Umachilototan, notice this, and they feed them almost like little children because their husbands are so exhausted. Umarchitzototan, and they would wash them. V'sachototan, and they would bathe them. Umashkototan, and they would give them beverage. V'niskakot lahem ben tzvatayim, and there is a double connotation actually, mishakototan, which means literally they would give them mashke. But what other words did you hear here? Especially v'niskakot lahem ben tzvatayim. Again, they would kiss them. Basically, they would engage in foreplay. Again, based on the pasuk in Tehillim, v'zachu Yisrael leviza b'mitzrayim shenemar kanfei ona nachzav b'kesef. And how do you know that we're talking about sexual foreplay? Because kevan shemitzabrot, again, and they did this so that their husbands would still engage with them, so that they would also have more children, even during these crazy oppressive times. And then that what would happen, they would go home. And then when it came time for them to give birth, even if it meant putting their life at risk, they would go out to the middle of a field, as we know from Shir Hashirim, they would give birth under the apple tree. And the Midrash continues to say, and then they would give birth, and the children would be literally nurtured by the ground, by Mother Earth, miraculously, and they would come up years later and return to their families. Beautiful. Again, now even that is trying to say that this whole notion of the growth of demographics was nothing less than miraculous. Okay, but it wasn't miracles on its own. It was miracles that were initiated by this tremendous emunah, literally by the defiance, but also by, again, notice this, the tremendous sense of belief that these women had. Again, the drive for survival. And once again, one can argue that this is a basic sense of morality, right? That they just didn't want Paro's evil decrees to stop them from bringing children into this world. Another ma'amar, Vayitza Paro, Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, Afal Pi, Afal Amo Gazar. Again, just like Sarah was stating before, even on his own nation, he said, you must all kill your children. Wait. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, Shalosh Gzeirot Gazar Betchila, Im ben Huva Mitzanoto. Ulbasov Kol haben hayelod hayaora tashlichu, because the miyaldo to find the first Gezerah, that if it's a Hebrew boy, kill him. That's when Paro instituted that all the children be killed. Ulbasov af alamo Gazar. And then in the middle of all this, you find, what did he do? Why does it say that he walked and he took? Because really what happened is that Amram was Gadol Hador. And when he saw Paro's evil decree of killing all boys, again, Amar Lishav Anu Amelin. So then why should we stay as a family? We can't bring children into this world. So he made a public statement. How are we going to respond to Paro's decree? We are going to not have homes for now. Amad Begireshet Ishto. He divorced himself from his wife. And because he was the leader of the generation, that's what all the men did in Su. The Amra lo bito, but his daughter, who had a basic sense, and Chazal says she was 5 years old at the time, she came to her father and she said, Abba, kashe gezerotcha yoter mishel Paro. Abba, what is with you? Your decrees are worse than Paro's. Shaparo lo gazar el hascharim, vatagazart el hascharim, v'al hanakivot. What, you don't think that there's any value in having girls? Gana, there still are children that can be brought into the world. That's moral problem number one. Moral problem number two, Paro lo gazar el olam hazeh, v'tabo olam hazeh ulo olam haba. Paro would only be killing children from this world. You're depriving them of a place in this world and next world. Paro lo gazar, or last one, Paro harasha safek mitkayemet gzerato safek eina mitkayemet. There's a safek, maybe 99% of male children will be killed, but there's a safek, there's room for survival over here, but you're a tzaddik. B'vadai shegzeratcha mitkayemet. Amram, if you would act in a proper way, then I'm sure Hashem would help you out. Shenemar batigzor, Omer vayakam lech amad v'hechzir et ishto. That's why he got up, because he responded to something. He responded to literally, again, this moral defiance of his daughter. And one can even argue, again, being so awed and impressed by his own wife. And for that matter, for all the women in Mitzrayim, again, the husbands were so, and one, again, the Torah is not blaming them for anything. They're exhausted. Again, they're not culpable for their lack of faith, but what's remarkable is to see the contrast with the women who do not lose faith, again, who are the ones to really drive the future of Am Yisrael forward. Amdu kulan be'achziru et neshotehen. And therefore they all got up in light of Amram, and they all returned, or they restored their wives. So now that we know the story and we see these remarkable women, we're going to go back and try to understand, wait a second, we already saw the introduction of remarkable women, not in Perek Bet, but actually in Perek Aleph with the Mialdot. And the question then is, who are these Mialdot? Let's take a look. Sorry, Ibn Ezra explains, Sarot hayu ala mialdot. They're parallel to the Sarei Misim. These are officers of midwifery. Meaning, I'm sure, especially because Am Yisrael are growing and multiplying at a remarkable rate, that I'm sure there were over 500 midwives, he says. These two, it's not that there were two for all of the Hebrews, these two were the officers, meaning hayu alehen latet mas lamelech mehasachar, which meant that they also had to file, for a tiyum mas. They also had to pay income tax from whatever they earned. V'kacha re'iti hayom b'mkomot rabot. So he says, basically, they were officers. And what's he saying? Saying that chances are they're Egyptian, but ha'im v'habat hayu b'derech Kabbalah. He says, but we have a tradition that it was actually a mother-daughter team. And Ibn Ezra, such a Pashtan, says, Nachonhu. It really is true. What is he referring to? He's referring to what Chazal say about these Mialdot HaIvriyot. Machloka between Rav and Shmuel. One says it's a mother-daughter team. And the other say a mother-daughter-in-law team. What does that mean? Hebrew or Egyptian? No, Manda Amar Isha Obita, they're Yocheved and Miriam. So now can anyone tell me, why would Chazal say this? Out of all the mothers and daughters, to say that Shifra and Pua are Yocheved and Miriam. So here is the example of when what the Chazal are basically saying is when you have the presentation of characters that you don't know so much about, you don't even have to wait till Chazal to see the perpetuation of their personalities. The Torah preserves their personalities. What does that mean? This is a brilliant midrash. And therefore, why can Chazal say that Choni Hamagel is like Eliyahu Hanavi? Because the Torah already says that there are characters like biblical characters. In other words, Yocheved and Miriam remind you so much of the Mialdot. Can anyone tell me how? So we saw textually, if you remember, that by the Mialdot and by Yocheved and Miriam, we saw the words of Re'iyah, seeing, and not just seeing and being passive, but seeing and fearing, seeing and having a sense of morality, which encourages you to get up and proactively save the children. Okay, what else? Anything else about them? Both stories, right? Children are being born. In both stories, these women are defying Paro and Paro's decree. And again, in one, the decree is kill the child at birth, and the other, the decree is throw the child in the Nile. But both of them defy the decrees. And not only that, what do? How did they defy the decrees? Do you remember by the Mialdot, what did it say? Vatachayena et hayeladim. They go out of their way to keep the children alive. So too Yocheved and Miriam, right? Yocheved goes out of her way, right? Taking the child, putting him in a teva, putting zefet, and again, making sure it's waterproof, again, taking care of him, hiding him for 3 months. And then the sister goes out and makes sure that everything is okay. So notice the Chazal say, look, the Torah is teaching you that the personality is preserved. The personality of the Mialdot can be easily identified through Yocheved and Miriam. And you could argue, wait a second, maybe not just Yocheved and Miriam, but how about a mother and a daughter-in-law? It could also be Yocheved and Elisheva. Again, the Breita even says, Isha ubita, there's even stronger proof to say mother and daughter, to say that because we have another tradition that teaches us Shifra is Yocheved. So then why is her name Shifra? Again, I guess she's not an ambiguous character. So the truth is that she's not totally anonymous, but she is ambiguous because we never hear anything else about Shifra. So Chazal say because her name wasn't really Shifra. Shifra was her officer name, right? Was her function. Her job was to clean off the baby. Or maybe she's called Shifra because she's responsible for the Pirya Virivya, Shifra, Pirya, for the demographic growth of Am Yisrael. And Pua zo Miriam. And why is she preserved as Miriam? Shaita Pua, because she would literally infuse the baby, either infuse him with wine to stop him from crying, or if he wasn't breathing so well, infuse him with CPR. Again, these are really the explanations that are given. Or Shahita Pu'a B'Ruach HaKodesh. Or as we already saw, she was infused with divine inspiration because she knew, she went to her father and basically said, Ima's going to give birth to the future savior of Am Yisrael. Whatever the case is, we see that Chazal are preserving the mother-daughter or mother-daughter-in-law that we see in Perek Bet. They're saying, do you all notice that it's the same personality? So you don't have to wait until you get to, the time period of the Tanaim in order to see similar personalities. The Torah itself is telling you and testifying to the fact that you're going to have throughout the generations different personalities who remind you, who go out of their way, and they're particularly female, which leads Rabbi Akiva to say this is going to happen in every generation, that basically their personality is preserved. And if you think about it, it not only infuses us, particularly as women, to look back and say, wow, we should be like these women. But basically what Chazal are saying is you are like these women, whether you like it or not. Again, every mother-daughter is like this mother-daughter in the sense that a mother-daughter is all about continuity. And that's why I had mentioned that it's so beautiful that Lee and Bella are learning this together, right? A bat is a bayit. A bat is the one who literally continues the bayit. That's why she's called a bat, as opposed to a ben who builds. But he basically is going to build b'niyah. He's going to build off of the father. But there isn't an inherent connection between the Abba and the Ben, which is why, going back to Parshat Vayechi, why Yaakov has to bless Ephraim and Menashe, right? My students always ask me, that's so unfair. Why is it that the boys get their own But the girls, we just say, oh, you should be like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. And the answer is because it's not natural for the boys to continue their father. Again, Yaakov is saying, he's not blessing Manasseh and Ephraim, he's blessing Yosef. And he's saying, Yosef, I hope that your children will continue my legacy, that your children will relate again to me the way that I relate to my grandfather, the way that I relate to my Avi Avraham and Avi Yitzchak. Basically saying, I hope that your children will identify with their legacy the way that you identify with your legacy. Whereas by a girl, you don't have to say that. Notice that Rivka never met Sarah. Rachel and Leah never met Rivka, right? Meaning naturally, there's either a mother-daughter-in-law or mother-daughter connection. The bat is the bayit. Again, we naturally continue the home. And I don't just mean have the same recipes as our mother. We build the home the same way. We have that same sense of connection to the bayit, and that's why we're the bat. That's why we're the daughter, which means that we're also going to be the mother of the daughter, right, of the next generation. And that's what's so beautiful, that Yocheved and Miriam, again, who don't even have a name in Perek Bet, they don't need a name. Just like Shifra and Puah don't really need a name. Again, Chazal say it's all about what they're doing. And the Ramban mentions it's not just, again, the mother and daughter, but it's even mother and daughter-in-law. Again, that's why, who is this Elisheva bat Aminadav? Again, she, as we know, and she is here we go. Kasher hiskir im hanivim lechvodam lamar shehi bat Levi ish tzadik nirma shenase banes ken hiskir im hakuhuna. You have to know that Elisheva, again, from Shevet Yehuda, actually, she's going to be the mother of, again, of Kahuna. And sure enough, again, we know that Miriam is going to be the mother of kingship. And she's also, who else is Elisheva from Yehuda? Achot Hanasi Hagadol. Again, she's also related to kingship. She is the sister of Nachshon. V'skiri Moshe Pinchas, shu gam ken kohen shezacha ba be'atzmo. And again, therefore, we see that, again, over and over again by Melachim, we also have the name not only of the father mentioned, but the mother of kings. Why? Whether it's Macha, Bat Avishalom, again, V'shem Imo, Azuva. Again, we need to know who the mother is, because let's take a look. Because the mother, the choice of the mother is going to be very significant. About bat bito, whatever the case may be, the mother is going to set the tone. And therefore, it doesn't really make such a difference, again, whether, again, this is Yocheved or Miriam or perhaps someone else, because the point is that it's their personality. And Josephus says, again, as he relates the stories, he says, what really happened? Let's take a look. He says, again, he commanded, right, the midwives that they should cast every male child which is born to the Israelites. Again, and besides this, the Egyptian midwives should watch the labors of the Hebrew woman and observe who is born, right? He says these are Egyptian women. But what's amazing is that, again, even though, again, and he said that if they transgress his commands, what did he say? Sorry, again, he said, excuse me, sorry about that. Todah, he enjoined that if any parent should disobey him and venture to save their male children alive, they and their families will be destroyed. And this was a severe affliction to those that suffered, and they were deprived of their sons. And while they were parents themselves, they were obliged to be subservient to the destruction of their own children. But it was supposed to tend to the extirpation of the nation, while upon the destruction of their children and their own gradual dissolution, the calamity would become very hard and inconsolable. But what happened? He said, this is amazing. You can imagine that if everyone was killing their children, right, this would lead to, forget about the thwart and growth of Am Yisrael, it would also lead to such terrible, inconsolable grief of the people, that's what would kill them, literally their grief. And that's what's so amazing. He says, again, it doesn't make a difference if they were Egyptian midwives or not. In all these cases, we find that what happens is that both, again, the midwives, here we go, again, both the midwives and the mothers of Israel, not just this Ish and Ishami Bat Levi, that they went out of their way, they defied. And that's what gives hope to people, right? That what was amazing is that Paro never thought that these would be the consequences, that they would, even if they knew that their children were going to be killed, they didn't give in to this. And you can imagine that this is not only what gave them hope, this is what plants, again, out of all the stories of Galut of 210 years, again, we only hear these stories. We hear the stories of defiance. We hear the stories of the mothers and the midwives who are going out of their way to keep children alive. And you can imagine then that this is what infused the entire generation with hope in the future. Again, and that's exactly what we see. Again, the Targum Onkelos even says, who are these midwives? They were Chayuta Yehudita. Again, this is the Jewish spirit. Again, it's not just a universal sense of morality that in every generation you have, but you have a Jewish spirit. Again, I don't think that it's by chance that, again, that we have so many chisunim. It's because it's in our blood. It's in our blood to go and to keep ourselves alive. It's in our blood, again, to defy the reality, to defy the gzeira of the times, and to say, we're going to survive, we're going to overcome, we're going to do whatever we can. We're not going to let the grief get to us, because we're not going to give in to this decree of death. We're going to go out of our way. And that's why the Mialdot are literally molidot, says Rashi, right? They're giving birth to more. Again, Shifra is Yocheved, Shemishaperet Tavlad. Pua, says Rashi, preserving that midrash from Gemara Sota, is Miriam Shepua, Umedaberet, Vahogal Layeled, Kederach Anashim Hamifaiso Tinok Haboche. Again, because we have that natural, the natural, one can even say calming, the natural maternal instincts. And therefore, again, Rashbam says, don't read it just as mialdot et ha'ivriot, read it as mialdot shehein ivriot. And therefore, the Malbim says, you understand what's going on with regard to the pshat and the drash? The pshat is telling you, amar la mitzriot shayu mialdot et ha'ivriot, vayash shnei minei mialdot. He says there were two functions of mialdot. He says, actually, the pshat is that these were Egyptian, right? Egyptian midwife officers who gave birth, who were in charge of everything going on with Hebrew midwifery. And every midwife team had, or every midwife had a pair, right? One had to deal with the mother, right? As we know, even today in the hospital, right? One was the midwife who was helping the mother, again, literally give birth to the child. And the other took the baby, gave him his Apgar test, again, literally, lachrot taburo, cut his umbilical cord, valasot trachav. One was called Shifra and the other was called Pua. Isn't that cute? Like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, meaning that was what you called them. You called one of them, again, one can even say the main midwife, the assistant midwife, meaning their official names for their jobs. Again, her name could have been Rachel and Leah, but one was called Shifra, the other was called Pua. Are you on Shifra duty today or Pua duty today? Everyone see this? Are you going to take care of the mother or are you taking care of the child? He says, and that's what it means, that he wasn't just commanding two particular midwives. He was telling, again, all the midwives, again, all the Egyptian midwives, okay, all you Shifras and Puas out there, when you give birth, you have to kill the children. But, or Ibn Ezra says, or maybe he told the two primary Shifras and Puas, meaning the Sarot al-Kulan, and again, and they were the ones who had to tell everyone else. And just like he consulted with his officers, he consulted also with the midwifery officers. And he said what should be done, again, to stop the growth. And they didn't say anything. Only when he came up with the plan, then they defied his plan, which tells us, going back and seeing that if we're talking about Egyptian midwives, then we're also speaking about universal morality, just like we saw by Avraham Avinu, just like we saw Yosef explaining as well, again, to the all of the Sar HaMashkim, the Sar HaOfim, Et Elokim ani yareh, I have a universal sense of morality. Again, in Sefer Dvarim, the people of Amalek are accosted with not having Yirat Elokim. They didn't have the basic sense of universal morality. So we see this idea as well, that, again, Chazal are preserving, it's not about your nationality, just women naturally have. Again, look at Bat Paro. She also has this Ri'iyah and Yirah, right, of not being able to tolerate seeing children like this. I remember the you know, all the commercials, I think they're still going on, right? For donations for children in Africa, they would show you like children with swollen bellies and eye diseases. And again, and sure enough, studies showed you that who actually like would call, and you'd have to call up to make a donation. And sure enough, 99% of those who called up to make a donation were women. So they started showing these commercials, particularly during soap opera hours. Isn't that interesting? When women are, in any case, like emotionally geared, and then you see children like this, it doesn't make a difference. If you're sitting in Oklahoma or you're sitting in Russia, again, you're going to call because you can't just sit again and watch children suffer. You have to do something about this, right? That's the universal morality that we see that Moshe, regardless of the fact that he was brought up in Beit Paro, he also has this. Moshe, who was saved because of the basic sense of survival, Moshe is going to go out and save others, which in fact is the Haftorah. Becky mentioned at the beginning, this is the Haftorah of the week from Yeshayahu. Moshe Amo. Again, this is a universal idea that's going to take us through every generation, and therefore the Rambam says, don't think again that you can't be like Moshe Rabbeinu. Ela kol adam ra'oi lo liot tzaddik k'Moshe. Now this is interesting because the Rambam also tells us that lo kam, based on the Torah, lo kam navi k'Moshe. You're never going to be able to reach the religious, spiritual height of Moshe Rabbeinu, but you can all reach the moral height. You can all be righteous like Moshe, or you can be a Rasha like Yeravam. In other words, that's a choice that you make. But I think that is particularly interesting that when it comes to men have to make that choice, right? For women, I don't even think we consciously actually make that choice. I think it's, again, Vatir'enna, we see, Vatir'enna, and we fear, right? That the two words go hand in hand, one with the other. And this then is a beautiful example of the roots of conservation of personality, wherein Chazal are saying, even within the Torah, there's conservation of personality, that we don't have to skip and look and see who's the Shifra and Pua of this generation. Of course, you're going to look around and you're going to see, again, all these organizations that, again, are here to, again, whether it's, Women in Green, or whether it's, again, the Chayalim, the Women Biad HaChayalim HaBodedim, or look at any humanitarian organization. Again, chances are there's a woman behind it, because we're the ones who go out and say, "B'zchut nashim tzedkaniyot shebachol dor atidin b'nei Yisrael lihigael." But we see that really the paradigm begins here at the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, the first time that we see national crisis, the first time that we see galut. Again, who's really behind the scenes? There are these mialdot, Shifra and Pua, but really we don't know so much about them. Don't worry, you do. Again, it's every single woman. Look at Parakabet. Again, the same. Again, either the same woman or the same model, the same personality of women, you're going to see going out of their way in order to save their own child. And therefore, Chazal say, oh yeah, so it must be that Yocheved and Miriam, or call her Yocheved and Elisheva, call it, again, really, whatever mother-daughter, again, call it all the mothers, all the future mothers, all the daughters, all the future daughters of Am Yisrael, bring us back to Shifra and Pua. And basically, they're the ones who plant the seeds of redemption. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
תודה, שני, שבוע טוב.
בשמחה.
שבוע טוב לכולם. Have a good week, everyone.
Yes, you too, everyone.